So with each of these pieces, I'm just going to talk about some things that I think are relevant to practice and will be useful for practicing and preparing as well as performing. I'm not going to talk about every possible thing, but just the things that kind of come to mind as I was preparing and things I think will be useful to share. So for the first of the state/district audition pieces, the tempo I went was dotted quarter note equals 64, or just roughly around there. I may have went a little faster, I think, in the recording than that particular tempo. I think around there, though, is a good goal tempo. For this piece, I think you should be thinking of the piece in one rather than filling each individual three of those beats. So, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So filling that big beat rather than the 1, 2, 3, 4, because I think it helps better with phrasing. Um, Another thing I want to point out in this piece is there is a key change in the piece. It sometimes kind of feels like there isn't one because there is a lot of C sharps through the use of accidentals in the second half. But remember, in the first half of this one, we are technically in D major. We have two sharps, and then when we go to the trio section, which I don't have marked, but I might write that in. But when we go into this trio section, as we would in a march, we add one flat, or in this case, take away one sharp. There is a key change here. There just happens to be a lot of C sharps in that. So when we get into the second section, make sure that you are using C naturals unless otherwise marked as C sharp. And then, in those sections where there are C sharp, make sure that you're playing C sharp, and then if it goes into the next measure and there happens to be another C, that you are playing C natural instead. I will say in my edition and the edition here too, I try to honor the courtesy accidentals that were included. Another thing I think to keep in mind is the style markings or expression markings. Dolce, if you don't know, dolce means sweetly. And I think that pertains particularly to the dynamics, particularly like the hairpins and stuff. Because it's marked sweetly, I would not overdo any of the swells. I certainly wouldn't, in this, 3-beat measure, which you're filling in one, I wouldn't try to, go from like pianissimo to fortissimo and those maybe 3.5/16 notes and then back down. So, any of those swells I think are just kind of like little warmings, just because it has that dolce marking. I think another thing to consider is also the phrasing. So in my performance of this, I didn't take every single breath mark. However, I think the breath marks that are given are very good, and if you take every single one, I think the phrasing should be just fine. However, I think just because the tempo I went, I was able to kind of, go just about every other breath mark. But I think thinking of phrasing will kind of also, and that's why I also think about in one. I think the thinking in one helps to fill that overall pulsing. I think if you think each three individual beats, the phrasing becomes a little too short, and you want to think longer phrases in this, at least 4 measures, which are kind of nicely pointed out with the breath marks. Now, one thing I found particularly difficult with practicing this section is after, in our second section here, after the first repeat, the G sharp, G natural, E, and then down to the C sharp. I found that this C sharp in particular was very, very difficult. So I'm going to go over some ways that I think are useful to practice this. So the first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to have a plan for how you're venting it. I think there are several different ways you go about fingering this, but I think there are 3 of the best options would be in this particular section in regards to venting and using the whisper key would be for the G sharp in A, the G natural in A, and then the E to A, to not have your thumb on the whisper key and just be ready to use the vent key for each of those A's. And then this allows you, since you're not always going down to the whisper key, then when you're going to the C sharp, not necessarily worry about getting the C sharp, but absolutely worrying about the C sharp key and the low D key for the C sharp to respond. Another thing you can do is for the G sharp to A to G to A, because it's just a half step and a whole step, the venting isn't as important, so the A should still come out. So here's G sharp to A with venting. and then G sharp to A without venting. So, it still responds just fine, and it should work on the G. However, on the E to A, it's kind of a toss-up there. So here's E to A with venting, and then here's E to A without venting. And honestly, it works. It might depend a little bit on your bassoon. But what I would recommend doing is not worrying about venting on these particular two A's, and then venting on only this A, and that way your thumb is a little less to do, so then it can get that C sharp. The other thing I think you can also do here is actually not worry about venting at all, just from this G sharp to this low A. Not worry about venting any of these high A's, just to make sure that this C sharp responds. So in slow motion, I'll play each of those options. So the first option is venting all the A's, which I think is the most difficult. And especially as you go faster, getting the C sharp to A and venting this particular A, I think it's just very, very difficult to do. Then the second option, where we're not worrying about venting these two A's, but we'll vent this one and the second two A's. And I think that's a little easier because it's almost like your thumb has time to prep for it, having to move very quickly here as you go into faster tempos. And then the third option, where we're not worrying about venting at all. And I don't have the whisper key down either. I'm going to do that one more time. So they all work. Granted, not venting isn't great technique, but I think that part of the issue is as you start going faster and faster, it becomes very hard to make sure that each of these A's are vented. So I think having a plan. If you're going to vent them all, make sure you're always practicing that slowly. If you're just going to vent these two, make sure you're just venting those two. Or if you're not going to vent them all, make sure you're practicing that way. So just have a plan as you approach it. Another way I think you should practice this is making this C sharp here kind of an ending point in your practice as you're going, to make sure that you're getting the C sharp to respond. I found that the hardest part of that particular passage is just getting the C sharp to respond. So just making that C sharp an ending point. So I'm going to start at this pickup B A, and then I'll kind of show you what I mean. So just ending on the C and making sure the C sharp has a really nice tone. And then when you feel really comfortable landing the C sharp, seeing if you can then go on and get the rest of the passage. I personally think this is actually much easier, regardless of what you're doing with venting for the A's after. I just find that because we're going so low to the C sharp, it just becomes kind of cumbersome for your thumb to have to do all that motion. So in general, here are some just general practice tips for this entire piece. I would strongly consider, if you're having issues with any of the particularly longer runs of 16th notes, that you use what I would call add-on method, where you just play one note. So I'll just kind of demonstrate. And then as you become comfortable with one note, add just one more note. Play those two in succession. Then when you're really comfortable with those, add on. So I'll kind of demonstrate what that would sound like. Until you can play the whole passage. And so on and so on. So I would strongly recommend that if you're having issues with the 16th notes passages, just because they're faster, practicing with that add-on method. So this second piece from the district/state auditions is kind of clearly meant to be faster. Um, this tempo I have written in is my self-imposed tempo. It doesn't say that. And as far as I'm aware, it doesn't say a specific quarter note tempo in any of the editions. It just says Allegro. But I personally think just because this is obviously, repetitive eighths, repeating the same tone twice quite a bit, that it kind of lends itself to being a quicker Allegro tempo. And Allegro, obviously, a lot of people interpret it as fast, lively, quickly, words like that. So I think it should be somewhat faster. However, I personally would not go so fast that you feel the need to double tongue any of it, just because some of the passages do go a little lower, and the lower you go and you have to double tongue a bassoon, the less reliable those articulations will be if you end up having to, go so fast that you double tongue. And I also don't think it needs to go that fast either. So I have 168, which I know seems like a really big number, but honestly, I don't really think that's too fast. I think I actually may have went a little faster in my recording, so you could probably go a little slower, a little faster, but I think 168 would kind of be, if you're practicing with a metronome, would be a good goal tempo to get to. So the key we're in this one is E minor. So if you're really struggling with note accuracy, or you feel that it's kind of like awkward finger transitions from one note to the next, you might consider just practicing your E minor scale and your E melodic minor scale, just to kind of be acclimated to some of those patterns you're going to see. I think the biggest deal with this one, like if I was a judge and I was listening to it, I'd be listening for the difference in articulations. So for instance, we have lots of these staccato notes, staccato meaning detached. We have lots of these accented notes. The accent, that note should be louder at the start of the note, it should have an emphasis to the start of the note. Accented notes themselves, however, don't make a note shorter, so those accented notes aren't staccato. You can have an accent and a staccato on the same, but in this case they're just accents. And then we have some FZs and SFs, which I'm not gonna, I think I don't like pronouncing them, so they just call them FCs and SFs. But those are also like a type of accent, and I would say that they're like accent plus. So it's an emphasis on that note, but it's like the next level. Just how mezzo forte is medium loud and forte is loud. An accent is an emphasis, and then FZ is a little bit more of an emphasis, and SF is like subito. You might also say an SFZ. It's like suddenly. So here on these, you'll see we have an accent and an SF. So those are like really, really emphasized there. But all the the different type of articulations. Oh, and this should have tenutos. Let me end that real quick, because I believe those have tenutos in the written edition. Yeah, and then we also have these legato marks or tenuto marks, which I think they're officially called tenuto marks, but I think I've also heard people call them legato marks as well. So in this case, it's almost like an emphasis to contrast the staccato. It's almost like an accent on how long that note will be compared to all those staccato notes around it. I want to point out too, though, that these tenuto notes don't have accents, and it might feel very tempting because there are quarter notes to accent them as well. But in this case, these particular quarter notes are not accented. Going through my list here. So one of the ways I would recommend practicing this, especially if you're struggling with note accuracy, because this is all, for the most part, groupings of two of the same note, and then you just tongue them twice, is just kind of turning a lot of those into quarter notes as you work on it, to work on the note accuracy. So rather than just doing and just working on the quarter notes. Obviously, some of the eighth notes do change, so when you get there, you have to play them as written. And so on and so on. But I'd recommend practicing like that, especially if you're struggling with note accuracy. That way you don't have to always worry about your tongue. And as you're practicing too, you don't kind of wear yourself out, because if you're doing this a lot, the tonguing can get quite cumbersome. Okay, another thing I think that's important on this is make sure you're counting the rest and paying attention to them. When I play this particular one, I actually kind of like to fill it in two. And a 2E and a 1E and a 2E and a 1 and a 2, and kind of felt like that. I felt that made it actually a little easier to count the quarter rest, because it just made it less busy in my mind, rather than thinking 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1, 2 and 3. I don't know, it just feels very busy to me in comparison. But make sure you are counting the quarter rest. I think it's very easy for these quarter rests to either get a lot longer than they are, or to just kind of be overlooked, just because it's kind of like how the piece wants to feel, but it's not how the piece is actually written. But there is a rest there, but you can kind of skip it, and it doesn't necessarily feel like anything's missing. So just remember to make sure that you're accounting for that quarter rest each time. I think what's sometimes tricky about the quarter rest too is the half note before it. So making sure that half note only gets 2 beats, and then the quarter note gets 1 beat. So just kind of consider that as well. As far as the dynamic contrast goes, I don't necessarily think it has to be the hugest contrast. You just want to make sure that it's there, that you're softer, and then you're getting to a louder dynamic. Bassoon isn't gonna be groundbreaking with our dynamics. I'm not saying we can't play piano, I'm not saying we can't play forte, but don't feel like you should be able to make the same contrast that like a trumpet could make with a piano to forte dynamic, just because we simply can't play that loud. And if you're struggling with some of these fortes that kind of come suddenly, I almost like to think of these almost like they're in like a different character. So maybe this piano is like a more mischievous character, and then this forte is like an angry character kind of responding to that. Just to kind of give it some more bite to kind of help with the fact that it's hard to make that dynamic contrast, and I think that kind of helps too if you also can kind of add a little bit of a character to it. As far as with working on the tonguing as well, if you find that tonguing is particularly fatiguing, just how, to work on the note accuracy, you kind of simplify them to quarter notes. You can work on facilitating the tonguing and developing that technique by adding extra articulations. So instead of doing groups of 2, doing even groups of 3 or 4. And working on it like that, and that can also help to work on your endurance for tonguing as well. Also, with all of these, you'll notice I played them all with repeats. I would recommend that even though in the audition you're probably not going to play the repeats, that you do practice with the repeats. It only is going to benefit your endurance. And on the off chance that you're in the audition and they do want the repeat, it's not going to feel so super strange to you to do the repeat. Whereas if you're on the audition and they ask you to not do the repeat, it's pretty easy to not do the repeat, right? Because the second time you go through something, you're not doing the repeat. So I think it's a lot easier to leave to practice with the repeat and then have to leave it out later than vice versa. You also don't want to get in a habit of looking at a repeat and going, oh, we never do those, and then he'll read music and just ignore the repeats because you're in a habit of always ignoring the repeats. Just my 2 cents on that. But yeah, I think that kind of sums it up for this particular piece. Okay, so I want to talk quite a bit about this piece, just because there's a lot to it. So if you're, I don't know what edition you're particularly looking at, but at least in mine, it has this German, these three German words, which I will not pronounce, and then it has the English translation, which they have as the long grace note. So you might be thinking, as I play this, that I didn't do any of those grace notes correctly, and if they were modern grace notes, I would say that that would be accurate, that I didn't do any of those grace notes correctly. However, these would be more of what we would like hear in classical music or Baroque music, which we would refer to as appoggiaturas. Now, when I was in middle school and high school, I didn't know that. I actually didn't hear the term appoggiatura, but I did know that, at least in Mozart, sometimes grace notes weren't actually really played as grace notes. I'm not quite sure why that is. It's actually kind of hard to find any particular like textbook definition about appoggiaturas or Baroque and classical style grace notes very easily, because sometimes even the grace notes in those are played how we kind of think grace notes go. But this is how those grace notes should go. So any of these grace notes, because it translates to the long grace note, and I will link to a video I found in German that kind of talks about this as well as a few other videos about the appoggiatura that kind of explain to this. But essentially what it is any of those notes attached to, any of those grace notes, whatever note they're attached to, you're going to take half of that value. And in the case of this particular piece, at least with my edition, whatever the grace note looks like, that should be the length of it. So for instance, this looks like a quarter note, so it should be the length of a quarter note. And that, of course, will take half of that half note. Now, you might be kind of like, well, what am I supposed to do with the dotted eighth? I was listening to a Mozart flute quartet, and I didn't find any written rules on this, but what I assume you were supposed to do is ignore the dot, so pretend that the dot's not there, and then you would split the eighth note in half. In that case, it would become 2/16ths, right? So this would just become a 16th, followed by an eighth, and then the C16th. Now, I think you could argue that it's maybe that this particular grace note actually should be the eighth, and then it should be followed by 2/16ths, being a 16th note D, and then this written 16th note C. But I don't think that sounds very nice, so I just don't like that particular interpretation. But that's kind of the only appoggiatura that I think is kind of up for debate on the interpretation. Everything else should just be half of whatever it's attached to. And that is strictly because it's called the long grace note. Now, modern music is not written like this. It stopped being written like this for a while. And if you watch like the videos I linked to, you shouldn't see stuff. Only would I consider it maybe should be like an appoggiatura is if I was playing a piece that says something like in the style of Mozart, or something like that, or if it had a disclaimer saying that they wanted you to do it like that. And the reason they're not written like that anymore is because it's confusing. So yeah, that is why I played those grace notes. So if you're kind of listening to those grace notes going, you didn't do any of those grace notes, I would say yes, sort of. The other thing is, in other countries too, I've only heard the term grace notes for all these, but they really don't. They call them all sorts of other things in other countries. I learned as I was kind of researching this, which I found fascinating because I had never really heard any contrast to that. Okay, so let's talk about the other thing about this piece, which would be the tenor clef. Now, I would encourage you not to label any of the notes in the tenor clef and to learn to read the tenor clef just how you read bass clef. So what I would recommend you would do if it's your first time with tenor clef is you learn the note names of the lines and spaces first, just how you would with treble or bass clef when you were first starting learning. So I'll do that right now with you. So take whatever hand you want, your left hand, right hand, have it sideways, and have that kind of form the staff to where your fingers would be the lines and the spaces in between the fingers would be the spaces. So we'll start with the lines. So for the lines, I just like to think deface. So it'll be D, F, A, C, E. This is starting from the bottom to the top. D, F, A, C, E. So deface. It's like you're saying face with a D in front and right into face. So those will be the lines. So I'll do that one more time. D, F, A, C, E. And then the spaces will be E, G, B, and D. So, if you're familiar with, that, the treble clef thing, every good boy does. There's just no fine after it. But if you want to think of the F as the space above, I guess you can still do the E, G, B, D, F. But this also, if you're familiar with treble clef, this is just one step off from what treble clef is, which actually might make it a little more confusing for you because it is so close to it. So once again, the lines are going to be D, F, A, C, E, and then the spaces will be E, G, B, D. Now the other thing you can do is tenor clef is a C clef, so it's identifying where middle C is, so that fourth line will always be C. You can use that C as a grounding point, and then just kind of walk your way to any of those. But real quickly, I'm just going to go through the tenor clef sections here, and I'm just going to say the note names, just so we're kind of familiar, just so at some point you could have heard someone say them. So here we have B flat, G, E, D, B natural from that grace note, C, C sharp, D, E, A, then a 2-octave leap to our higher A, we're going to sustain that for a while, G, F, E, G, F, E, D, C, B natural, F, B, C, this is still B natural, just to clear because the accidentals carry through, B, C, B, A sharp, B, C, and then I'm going to skip to the next tenor clef section. F, E flat, C, D, B flat, G, C, A. I'm going to do that last tenor clef section. I feel like I went through it kind of fast. But F, E flat, C, D, B flat, G, C, A. And that's all the tenor clefs. So there actually really isn't too much tenor clef in this particular one. But that's all for the tenor clef. Another thing I want to talk about is the articulations. So this slur with the staccatos, this is what we'd call a portato. And that's a string technique. So I don't understand why we keep seeing these in wind music, but we do for whatever reason. And what it means for the string technique is to, usually they would alternate the bow direction going up and down to, that's how they would articulate notes. But a portato means to articulate the note but keep the bow going in the same direction. So in this case it'd be like up, 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 and it kind of makes a very smooth but pulsating sound. But the notes are still very much so attached. So the way I've been was told in high school is that you kind of just treat these like normal articulation. I would say if you're trying to honor what it would maybe sound like on a string instrument, that you're trying to almost make them more like legato or tenuto markings, and that there's just like a very slight articulation in between them, and that kind of creates a pulsating effect. At least that's what it should do on a string instrument. But yeah, the slur with the staccatos, that's called portato, or I think also sometimes it's called portamento. But I think you'll see portato more commonly for that. But that's what that is. These should not be like super short by any means. They should be longer notes. And if we look at our tempo here, sostenuto, that means sustained. So really nothing we're doing should be super detached or short by any means if we're kind of honoring our tempo marking, which is kind of giving us a clue into the style as well. Once again, we have dolce, and then with expression. So I would kind of interpret that the dynamics shouldn't be like super aggressive. They're just kind of nice, gentle swells to kind of guide the phrasing. I think the phrasing in this is fairly straightforward too, as most of it's kind of punctuated by eighth rest, so it's kind of easy to see where the phrasing is. Technique-wise, we do have like a lot of bigger leaps or bigger intervals from one note to the next. So for instance, I think that one of the first bigger ones is this D to F. The way to get this F to kind of come out very nicely and supported, as well as with any of the other big jumps, whether it's this A, this low C to B flat, or this low A to A, or this C to G. The support needed for that high note, whatever that following high note, needs to be present on the note before for that note to respond successfully. So for instance, if I were doing this D to F, the support for a high F needs to be present in this D, otherwise this F isn't going to respond. If I go to play that F and I don't have the support and I have to do it after the fact, it's already too late for that note to be successful. So for instance, if I like play from here and then I don't have good air support on this D, that's what here's what that'll sound like. That was painful. So as you can tell, it's also like really out of tune without the support as well. Whereas if I make sure that that D has adequate support, I might have to maybe loosen up so the D isn't overly sharp or anything like that. But I do want to still make sure that I have a good amount of air support, if anything, that I'm increasing the air support as I play that D so that the F comes out successfully. And same thing like with this G. And same thing from this C to B flat. Particularly with this C to B flat, it's really hard to do the slur because of the fingering, so I would honestly say just tongue the B flat, but just make sure you kind of tongue in a way where it's as smooth as you don't want the tongue to be super noticeable. But yeah, once again, on this low C, you need to have that intense air support so that a high B flat will come out correctly. And same thing with this A here as well. One thing I want to talk about is obviously this slow piece does lend itself very well to vibrato. However, if you're unfamiliar with doing vibrato, I don't think this piece needs vibrato to sound beautifully. It's really more about your control and use of subtle dynamics to shape the phrasing. So for instance, I'll just play the opening without any vibrato, and I think it sounds just as nice as if I was playing with vibrato, as long as I'm really paying attention to my use of dynamics to kind of color the phrasing. So yeah, I think it sounds just as nice. It's honestly much harder to play this without any vibrato, because you just have to have such great control. So if you're not comfortable with vibrato, honestly I wouldn't do it. Vibrato is a very tricky thing to teach and learn, and if you're not comfortable doing it, vibrato can also kind of inhibit good phrasing and good technique as well. So if you're not comfortable with doing it, just really work very hard at your phrasing with your dynamics and really try to hone in on your intonation. I think it can sound just as nice. Not being able to do vibrato certainly does not make you a bad musician or anything like that. Vibrato is very tricky. And the hardest part about vibrato is you want it to be natural. And oftentimes if you're first learning vibrato, it's kind of all you can do sometimes to produce vibrato at all, but it doesn't sound very musical because it doesn't sound natural, and that's the very tricky part about adding vibrato to something like this. I would say technique-wise, practice-wise, I think this piece is all about the phrasing and expression. So I think practicing singing it, you don't have to sing it, you could hum it, or just kind of imagine it in your mind and do like a wind pattern with it where you're just blowing air to kind of help try to shape the phrasing that you want. Or if you're really good at whistling, just whistling it to really work on that like song-like quality that I feel it should have. Also, if you're really struggling with note names, in particular with like note accuracy, in particular in the tenor clef section, I think fingering and saying the note names as you go, it doesn't necessarily have to be super rhythmic. I would try to keep it maybe somewhat close in the sense that if it's a longer note, wait, or if it's a shorter note, try to move on to the next note a little faster. But as you're doing that, as you're saying the note name and fingering, if you're finding that like you're saying the next note, for instance, so let's say I was here, so I'm like, okay, E, and I say A, but then it takes me a second to finger A. That's kind of an indication that I'm not used to that physical pattern. So, I would want to kind of practice that to make sure that as soon as I can say the note name and identify it, that I can also finger it just as quickly. Especially if you're unfamiliar too with any of the upper note fingerings or things like that. The high B flat might be a new note for you. But yeah, I think that's pretty much it with this one. Okay, so we have our little F major scale variation. This is from the Daily Studies, which I don't know any bassoonist who's ever done these daily, but that's what they're called. So this one's pretty straightforward. I want to kind of talk about the pattern on this because this is very much so is just a very set pattern. So if we're looking at least in my printed edition, it's one line, but if we're looking at the first 8 measures ascending, this is just it's just a variation of an F major scale, and then there's kind of an elaboration to it. So if we look at the first notes of each measure, F, G, A, B flat, C, D, E, F, and then same thing if we do the descending, it's just a descending F major scale. So knowing that, let's kind of look at the patterns. So we'll do this in halves. So we'll look at the first 2 beats and then the second 2 beats. So what's happening on each measure in these first 2 beats here from this F, A, B flat to D is we go up a third, so F to A, or in other words, we skip the second scale degree or whatever would be next in our F major scale, and then A, so we call that a third. When we're counting intervals in music, the note we start on is 1, so that's why it's a third, because 1, the line would be 2, and then this would be 3. Then we go up a step, or what we call a second, and then we do another third. So we have a third, a step, and then a third. And then this is all notes from the key. So it's going to be a natural note except for B flats from what's occurring from the key. So then the second half, also starting on the first scale degree or whatever scale degree it happens to be on, if you're in the second measure, the second scale degree, the third measure, third scale degree, so on and so on, is just going down a half step, back up to whatever that tone is, in this case an F, so back up a half step, and then down an octave. And it's always a half step. So in this particular pattern, in the ascending part, or the first 8 measures, the second half will always be down a half step, up a half step, and then down an octave. But it's always a half step, even if that half step doesn't belong in the key. So for instance, we don't see F sharps in F major, we don't see G sharps, we don't see B naturals. The reason you don't see an accidental here is because B flat to A is already a half step, but it's always a half step. And I would recommend, the way I would recommend that you kind of practice this is practice kind of where you're practicing those patterns I just talked about. So for instance, I would first practice this first half, and I would repeat it twice, so it would sound like this. Oh, sorry. Ooh, that was bad. And I would practice that first half just like that. And then I would work on the second half where it's whatever that particular tone is, down a half step, up a half step, down the octave. And so on and so on. I'm not going to play the entire pattern. practice it in halves like that, I think it really helps. So then when you're just wanting to go, go through the whole thing, it just feels a lot easier. Anyway, um, obviously I need to practice this one a little more. I will say it is kind of weird reading it off the screen. Anyway, okay, so let's talk about the pattern in the second half. So it's very similar. In the second half, or the last 8 measures of this, it's down a third, down a step, down a third. So kind of an inverse of what we were seeing here, where it was up a third, up a step, up a third. Now it's just the opposite of that, down a third, down a step, down a third. And then here is wherever that scale degree is, in this case F, up a step, and then down a step, up the octave. So once again, kind of a reverse of this. However, in this case, it's not always up a half step or a whole step. It's just whatever belongs in the key. So F to G would be a whole step, but then E to F is a half step. Or, if you want to think about it as a major second and minor second, if you're familiar with intervals. But it's just whatever that interval, it's a step with whatever is in the key. But it's just kind of the reverse of this. And I would practice this second half separately in those 2 halves, just working on this pattern from those first 2 beats. And so on and so on, and then the second half of it. And once again, just because if you practice it like that, then when you have to just play the whole thing, it just feels very smooth. And so on and so on. I do think this exercise should go somewhat fast. I have it at 152. I think you could go faster than that. I think you could maybe go a little slower and it would sound okay. Because it is a set pattern, this one is usually one that's kind of used to kind of show off like a little flary tempo, kind of show off your finger skills. Just how it's basically just showing off your fundamentals of technique. So I don't think I would go too slow. However, go wherever tempo is comfortable. But I think this 152 would be a good goal to have for your metronome marking. Okay, so this last one, which I don't think is particularly hard, but I think it's one of the harder ones to play consistency because it's lots of continuously bigger intervals. But I do want to kind of briefly, I want to try to make this maybe a little easier for you to read. So a lot of this, even though it might not look like it, it is somewhat of a pattern, and that pattern is very evident if you can kind of read chords. So a lot of this is just, not necessarily a pattern, I guess, but like a chord progression. And if you can read chords, it makes it a lot easier to read. So if you're not super familiar with theory. I'll try to make this as everyone friendly as possible. So we essentially have, I think, 7 different chords as options through this. So one of these chords is a C major chord, and in our C major chord, our options would be C, E, and G. And those are the notes that make up a C major triad or a C major chord. So for instance, if we look at the first 2 measures here, all these notes belong to a C major chord, so all our options for notes are just C, E, and G. So then if we look at our 3rd and 4th measure, if we look at our notes, we have C, F, and A. And usually we wouldn't spell it like that, like we were spelling chords in root position, but C, F, and A make up our F major chord or F major triad. So in measures 3 and 4, our only options are F, A, and C as notes. Alright, so moving along, if we look at our next part, so we're going to ignore the C for now because it's kind of recurring. Theory-wise, if you know more about theory, I would consider this C a pedal tone. But ignoring it just for a second, then we have F, A, and D. And these are the notes of our D minor triad or a D minor chord. So just kind of ignoring the C, or if you want to think of it as a passing tone, you can. Then really all our options are, with the exception of that C that occurs on the downbeats for measures 5 and 6, are just D, F, and A. And then moving along, ignoring the C once again just as a passing tone or a pedal tone, then we have G, D, F, G again, and B. And these are the notes of our G dominant 7th chord, or what would maybe just be called G7, and then the 7th would be assumed to be the dominant 7th. No, that's not what's written. So, but then written, it would sound like this. But in these particular measures, we only have 4 options of notes, which would be G, B, D, or F, with the exception of this C that's occurring here. So then if we move on, we're back to our C major chord here, so our options are C, E, and G. Then we have a new chord here, so if we look, we have C, E, and A. These are what would make up our A minor triad or our A minor chord, so our notes for these 2 measures would be either A, C, or E. Then moving along, we have our this is like our G dominant 7th. The difference is we don't have an F, so then this would actually just be our G major chord or G major triad. Then moving on, our notes would be that we have our D, C, A, and F sharp. These are the notes of our D dominant 7th chord. So those are the only 4 notes we have as options are D, C, A, and F sharp, or if I were to spell up, D, F sharp, A, C. And then we're back to our G major chord, and then really I would say this G belongs to the, at least chord-wise, belongs to the measure before, so that's part of that G major chord. And then moving on, it gets pretty straightforward from this point. So then this measure, we have our G dominant 7th, and then this measure I would also consider part of your G dominant 7th. And then this A sharp here, similar to what I was talking about with that low C that kind of kept returning, and the C sharp here, these are just passing tones, so they're not really affecting the core tones of it. They are there, but they're just passing tones. They're not necessarily the core tones of it. So really, chord-wise, for these 2 measures, it's just your G dominant 7th. And then moving on, then we're back to our C major chord for these 2. So once again, just C, E, or G. Then once again, back to that G dominant 7th. We have some passing tones with the A sharp and C sharp. Then back to C again. Staying on C. And then this F sharp, once again, just being a passing tone. Then going to our F major chord, which I think we've seen before, but just in case we haven't, F, A, and C are what makes up our F major triad, or F major chord, so C, F, A, C, F, A. So those are just notes of our F major chord, and same thing for this measure here, measure 28. And then this G sharp being a passing tone. Now, real quick before I keep going on with the chords, for the high A and the high G sharp, I would use the full fingering, if you don't know what that is. So for the high A, I would be fingering 1, 2, 3, the A vent key in the C sharp key, the resonance key, and then in the right hand it would be 2, 3, and then the B flat key with the thumb. And then for going on to the G sharp, all you would have to do from that fingering is lift your left hand thumb. So for the G sharp, it should be half. Well, and I guess the G sharp is half hold, but half hold 2, 3 resonance, and you can actually have the whisper key down for half hold notes, but it's not a huge deal, and it's passing so quickly. I don't know if I. Yeah, I personally don't do that, but if you move your thumb really fast and it bothers you, but I don't think it's not going to make a huge difference because you're not sustaining that on a long tone. But anyway, so for the G sharp, it'll be half hold 2, 3 resonance key. Whisper key optional, and then in your right hand it'll stay on 2, 3, and then the B flat key. So I would use those full fingerings for it, just because I actually think those fingerings feel smoother in this particular passage anyway. So just like that. So once again, though, that just being your F major chord with the G sharp being a passing tone, and then we're back to the C. And then we're back to our G7 chord here, and then once again finishing on C. Hopefully I didn't miss anything, but what I have written down, so all our chords are either a C major chord, which would be C, E, or G, an F major chord, which would be F, A, or C, D minor, which is D, F, A minor, which is A, C, E, a G dominant 7th chord, which would be G, B, D, F, a G major chord, which would just be G, B, D, or a D dominant 7th chord, which would be D, F sharp, A, C natural. So if you're finding this one particularly hard, I would recommend that you take a moment to just kind of practice those chords. Or maybe even just sit through the video as I'm kind of explaining each of those chords, and hopefully that can kind of help to clear up the reading part of the pattern to it. Because they're all bigger intervals, there's as far as I'm aware, there's not any step. Well, I guess there's some here in the passing tones, but for the most part, they're bigger intervals. There's not a lot of stepwise motion going on, which can make it harder to read. But if you can read chords and you understand what notes are comprising these chords, I think it becomes a lot easier to read. One thing I want to talk about that's kind of weird is this random crescendo and decrescendo that's written in the middle of it. I guess just do it, but I would say for the most part, it says with full tone. So, I would honestly be kind of crescendoing as I'm going up. And then even honestly as I'm going down, I wouldn't necessarily think of it as a just decrescendo, but then maybe kind of backing up just a little bit. But, for the most part, I would say that you're kind of staying at a louder dynamic. You want each of these notes to have a nice resonant quality to it. If this was an actual piece, this is absolutely the accompaniment to it. So you want those chords to kind of sound nice and full to whatever melody might be actually sounding above it. But yeah, also tempo-wise with this one, I don't think this one should go too fast. I think the faster you go, the more you risk notes not responding the way you want to. Like I said, I think earlier, this one I think is the hardest for the consistency because you are going up and down through the range so much. I think another thing to consider is as you are going into the upper register, making sure that you're not overcompensating or using too much lip pressure to get those upper notes to come out, that you're not working harder than you have to. One way I would recommend that you practice this actually is play your lowest note, which in this case would be a low C, and really think about how the lips in placement of your lips on the reed and the pressure you're applying, and then play the whole piece with that placement and lip pressure, which will not sound great, but play it like that. Which, as you can tell, doesn't doesn't sound great. But the point of that being to then go back and start to gradually add in how much lip pressure and how much reed you'll kind of have to take in to get the upper notes to sound nice. I think it's very easy to over-apply pressure and take in too much reed, which will make you work harder than you need to, and it can make you quite tired before you get to the end of the piece. I think you might be surprised by how little you can actually do to actually get these to be in tune and sounding part of the same phrase. Of course I fudged notes when I'm trying to demonstrate stuff, but that's okay. We all make mistakes. It happens. Anyway, breathing-wise, I would say as long as if you can't do 4-measure phrases, try to do 2-measure phrases. But I would say as long as you're breathing in between the slurred groups, I think that's fine. Obviously, maybe try to avoid breathing after this particular one. But it can still sound very nice just depending on your execution of the breath. I think as long as you're breathing at the end of the slurred groups, wherever you end up having to breathe, I think is fine, because these are much longer phrases, and there's not any written breaths, so you kind of just have to make do with whatever your own physical ability is. So for instance, if I was here, maybe I'll start here, and then I really had to breathe here. I think as long as you can take a quick enough breath and you don't play this B too short, I think it'll sound fine. That's not optimal, but I'll try to demonstrate. Once again. It's maybe a little clunky, but it's certainly not the worst. That being said, if you're there, maybe you could try to push through, so then you can use these 2 quarter rests to take a real nice breath. Another thing I think because there isn't a lot of rest in this one at all, there's not any great spots to breathe, it might be wise on this first quarter note to actually exhale some air, get rid of that carbon dioxide that might be kind of building up in your lungs, and then to use this third beat to breathe. Sometimes the problem with bassoon playing is that we kind of have so much air that we can't get rid of, and our body starts converting it. We'll be taking in more and more air, but we haven't released any of that old air yet. So it can almost make you feel like you're not breathing enough. But sometimes what you want to do is actually exhale some of that air. So in those 2 beats in between, I don't know why that moved, but it's kind of weird. But with those 2 beats in between, whether it's they're asking for the repeat or you're going on to the next section, you might really consider actually exhaling air in that first quarter rest if you can. That being said, too, rhythmically, make sure that you're still counting this. That's only 1 beat. A lot of times, because it's the end of the phrase, you might hear stuff like, and then these quarter rests, which have already been eaten up by the quarter note being way too long, get even longer. So make sure that you are still thinking of that stuff kind of rhythmically as well. And same thing when you get to the end, right? It's a quarter note. There's no fermata. Versus, which just sound nice, if you were playing this for a recital or something, not sure why you would, and you wanted to make it longer, go for it. But at least in the audition, I would not do that. And I would try to stick to as true as what's written. All right, okay, I think that kind of sums it up. So if you have any questions about any of them, feel free to comment below. If there's enough interest, I might also do a video on scales. All right, thanks for listening.